I'm still waiting for David to be curled up in a fetal position on the floor, whimpering.
For what?
Just as he gets connected with his inner child and, I don't know, receives some internal healing.
Nobody wants to see that. Hello and welcome to another episode of Plain True, the Holy Spirited podcast. I'm Maggie Ulmer on Zoom, and I have to start this podcast because we're going to run out of time. All right. Now, the people I normally record with, please introduce yourselves.
I'm Scott Kisker.
I'm David Watson.
And our special guest today is...
Kevin Watson.
Yay, Kevin Watson.
They're brothers, by the way.
Mm-hmm. We definitely need more confusion about that.
Kevin Watson. In all seriousness, we have Kevin Watson on the podcast today, and we're really going to leave that as our introduction.
What does that mean?
A question to start out with.
Yeah.
What's your question?
Who is Kevin Watson?
I have a question. Whose phone is ringing in the background?
It's mine. I'm ignoring it.
Can you train your children to answer the phone? Because I haven't been able to. That's all I'm saying.
Listen, I have a 20-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 10-year-old. So clearly the answer is no one's answering the phone. Anyway, Kevin, who is Kevin Watson? Kevin Watson, please tell our listeners about you. I find it difficult to think. It's difficult to imagine that they don't already know who you are, but, for the uneducated masses.
Well, that's a big question. How much time do you guys have?
Not much time left. Oh my God, talk.
Could you please bare your soul in front of America or the 17 people who listen to this podcast?
We are throwing out podcast gold here today.
Oh my gosh.
Well, probably what people care the most about is I currently teach Wesleyan and Methodist studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University and am an ordained elder in the Oklahoma Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Amen. That's awesome.
You wrote a couple of books.
At least a couple.
I've written a couple of books.
Yeah.
A couple few.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Your most recent book is called...
Older New School Methodism.
And what is that book about, Kevin?
Oh my goodness.
The scariest part about being on this podcast is that I've heard on released podcasts probably a dozen times, we'll edit that out. And that means it wasn't edited out. So I just assume all of this is going to be in the actual episode.
It's 100% because David is so entertained.
So Older New School Methodism. The book is my attempt to try to talk about the meaning of Methodism as a theological tradition, and it came out of wrestling with I think contemporary accounts of Methodism that I think are biased towards more recent, not just historiography, but also just kind of contemporary agendas for Methodism, the desire to see Methodism as a big tent theological tradition where there's a really strong emphasis on sermons in Wesley like Catholic spirit and an underemphasis on sort of the particularities of Methodism, the things that actually make it distinct and defined and sometimes actually a pretty narrow and specific way. And the impetus for writing the book was realizing that, so I taught a class when I taught at Seattle Pacific University, and a student, it was the only time I've ever taught a history and doctrine course that had United Methodist and Free Methodist students in it. So the only time I've ever taught sort of a required course for ordination that had folks from two different traditions in it. And when I got to Free Methodism, I said, sort of just casually off the cuff, something about when B.T. Roberts left the Methodist Episcopal Church, and a Free Methodist student immediately said he didn't leave the church, he was kicked out. And of course, as soon as he said that, I knew that. And so it was this kind of interesting moment of like me being confronted by a student with my own way of like re-narrating the history in a way that actually wasn't true, and skewed it in a way that was beneficial to the dominant strain that becomes the United Methodist Church. And there was something about that experience that stayed with me and made me continue kind of thinking about the way in which we tell the history, and also that it's Methodism as a whole is almost always told from, I would say, kind of like a mainline liberal theological perspective, because the United Methodist Church has had a lot more kind of resources and institutions to support scholarship and history of the tradition. So I was trying to really understand this kind of particular moment when there was a division, and the more that I read B.T. Roberts himself and the other people's accounts of the division that led to the Free Methodist Church, the more that I became convinced that what was happening was there was an actual disagreement about what it meant to be Methodist, and that there was a key side of our tradition that says Methodism isn't anything that you want it to be. It's not like broadly defined. It's actually very specifically defined, and if you abandon those essentials, you're abandoning Methodism itself. Right. And I thought it was particularly interesting because in the argument that happens when B.T. Roberts is expelled from the church, both sides in some ways are actually accusing the other side not only of not being sufficiently Methodist, but of not being sufficiently Christian. So it's actually the opposite of the way that it had been talked about when I started this research. Kind of, everybody, there's room for everybody at the table. Don't overdo distinctiveness because then people will be left out. Both sides in this disagreement actually were arguing for the opposite, and it was a sort of struggle for the future of the church itself. And I also thought the history was interesting because it's a moment where people who are more theologically liberal are willing to actually expel people from the church because of those disagreements. So they were motivated enough to try to enforce their particular understanding, that they were willing to actually expel people from the church for it, and did.
What era are you talking about? For all
B.T. Roberts was twice tried in 1857 and 1858. He appealed both guilty verdicts in 1860, and that appeal was tabled at General Conference. So that's
just before
recourse.
the Civil War breaks out.
Yeah. Yep. And it was also interesting that I've always been struck by both times the charges that were brought against him started with a charge of unchristian and immoral conduct, which is to me like a pretty serious charge. It wasn't just like he was impolite or something like that. It was unchristian and immoral conduct, and he was found guilty both times.
And what was he guilty of actually doing?
Well, he wrote an essay that was called New School Methodism. And the essay was basically critiquing what he saw as the new school. So he was in favor of old school Methodism. For him, old school is good, new school is bad. And it's a pretty strong critique of new school Methodism. And the critique itself was offensive to new school Methodists. And so it was the essay, the content of the essay that they brought him up on charges for.
So the immoral conduct was actually publishing an essay that criticized certain leaders in New School Methodism. Yeah,
it's a strange history because they charge him with immoral and unchristian conduct because he's defending Old School Methodism, which he would just say is Methodism, and he would of course say actually it's Wesley's Methodism, right? That's
I'm having deja vu right now.
All over again.
Yeah.
I suppose all of us could be charged with similar things at this point.
Yeah. So what are your hopes with this book? I feel like this is a little different from other books that I've seen you or that I've read of yours, like the band meeting, the class meeting, band meeting, which you wrote with Scott, and class meeting. This is a little bit of a different offering to the Wesleyan family. So what are your hopes for the readers, what they take from it?
Yeah, so my writing has been in two tracks that I hope are complementary and work together, but because of where I am and sort of the things I needed to do at Emory to work towards tenure, I had to publish things that were sort of technical academic writings, which we call monographs, and they're generally written for specialists within a particular field, and this book is an academic monograph, and so it's an attempt to contribute to what I think that 19th century American Methodism is the most kind of understudied, the least is known about, especially in the second half of the 19th century. The sort of short version histories usually talk about the spectacular growth and success of early American Methodism, and then they sort of jump to trying to understand what it means to be a Methodist today, or really jumps to the United Methodist Church, which of course was only founded in 1968, so it's relatively young. And there's oftentimes almost an entire century, maybe more, that's kind of just skipped over in that. So part of it was an attempt to try to do some spade work and initial digging just in understanding this period of history better. And a deeper motive is to say, so the big sort of argument of the book is that Methodism had like a real theological tradition, a real heritage that was identifiable by basically everyone who was Methodist or Wesleyan, not just people who were members of the Methodist Episcopal Church, but members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME Zion, the Wesleyan Church, like all these splits that we'd had, that there were still like common commitments that are primarily identified by this commitment to social holiness, or the idea that holiness, spreading scriptural holiness, is the purpose, the reason for Methodism, our mission, and that happens by joining together in community, especially through small group formation and watching over one another in love with a common expectation for specific lifestyle, and that's a thing that exists until I try to argue in the book that starts to break apart around the time of the formation of the Free Methodist Church. So the Genesee Conference, which is a part of New York State, centered around Buffalo, New York, represents a kind of particular moment. It's almost like a case study to see the beginning of the unraveling of Methodism as a theological tradition. And then I think what you see from there is Methodisms. You see different approaches to Methodism, different interpretations of Methodism. And my hope is that it helps people to see that there was actually I think seeing that there was something stable and really specific for a particular period of time is helpful to the church today, to see like there was a there in our kind of current confusion about what it means to be a Methodist, and where there are so many different ways of talking about it. I think it's helpful to see that for 3/4 of a century, there was, I think, a pretty stable understanding of that. And an entire sanctification was a key piece in that understanding. And then I think it's also helpful for me to then arbitrate a lot of the things that happened moving forward from that point, to go back to the point where they first started sort of dividing or splitting apart. So I'm hoping to get us to understand our heritage better and to understand our current conflict better.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
So you wrote the book on the class meeting, and then you and Scott wrote the book on the band meeting. And these are aspects, right, of what Wesley would call Christian conferencing, also aspects of what he'd call social holiness, right? And so explain the concept of social holiness, and why did you write about this aspect of Methodism rather than some other?
Yeah, I mean, so social holiness is a phrase that I think it might be helpful in some ways if we just stopped using it. Wesley, in his, he wrote a lot, and in his extant writings, he only uses that phrase once, and it's in an early collection of hymns and sacred poems in a preface. And really, what he's doing in that essay is critiquing the idea of what he calls holy solitaries, basically trying to grow in holiness by yourself. And there's a pretty sharp and probably unfair critique of like the desert monastic tradition in that essay, and sort of an underappreciation, I think, of that tradition and what it's offered to the church. But he then says, basically, he makes an analogy where he says holy solitaries is a phrase no more consistent with the gospel than holy adulterers. The gospel of Christ knows of no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. So he thinks that he can take for granted that his audience knows that you can't grow in holiness through practicing adultery, right? He thinks they'll get that, like, that dog won't hunt. If you say, hey, I'm going to become holy by committing adultery, you're becoming less holy. And so he thinks people will understand that that's the sort of comparison that's being made, in the same way that if you try to pursue holiness by yourself, you're going to become actually less. Yeah, you'll become you'll get taken out. And this connects in a lot of different ways in the things that he talks about. Like he actually does an experiment at one point in Methodism where what happens if we preach and sort of open air places, if we field preach, but then don't actually gather together the people who are awakened by our preaching into class meetings and actually connect them to each other. And they sort of, when they tried this experiment, his conclusion is basically that it's only begetting children for the murderer. So it's basically birthing Christians so that they can be destroyed by Satan. And so he thinks that's a bad idea and stops doing it if they don't have the resources
It doesn't sound like a good idea.
Yeah, he didn't think it was a good idea.
I just want to interject briefly here that our listeners can't watch you, but I think watching you explain this is really actually something quite special, because what you're talking about is so extreme. Like he's saying you not being in a relationship, a Christian community, is the same thing as, it's like trying to be holy by committing adultery. And I don't know, I was just entertained by the fact that you were like, he's assuming that people know that's bad. Well, yeah, it seems like a pretty easy jump to make, but maybe not.
Well, we'll see if my
What country do you live in, Maggie?
podcast.
So Kevin, this though what you're describing about social holiness, this hasn't really been a part of Methodism in or at least not United Methodism, and probably much larger than that, Methodism in North America for a long time, right? I mean, how did we lose this, and how do we get it back?
Yeah, I think we lost it in a variety of ways. I'm not entirely sure, but so I think the first thing I would say is there is a history. So Andrew Thompson wrote a great article, probably now about a decade ago, in Methodist Review, that really traces the history of like social holiness, being small group formation, and so forth. And Dennis Dickerson, who's one of the premier historian of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, pushed back pretty hard that there is a history within predominantly Black Methodist churches of using social holiness as a synonym for social justice, which has been the critique, right? It's clear that Wesley is not using it that way in that only quote. The only time he ever uses it, I think it's inarguable that Wesley is not talking about social justice as we think about it. He's not identifying some kind of systemic ill in the broader society and then using social holiness to do so. But so I think there is like a sort of a tradition for social holiness being used in a variety of ways that develops later. I also think that the main kind of thing that I see is that when Methodism, the MEC, grows like crazy and becomes the biggest the biggest denomination, the biggest religious tradition in the United States by far, what happens is they start to they're kind of a group of ragtag nobodies. And at a certain point when they become so big, they look around and they're like, we are somebody. We've become somebody just by sheer virtue of our numbers. And so you have people who start to, in a sense, ask for Methodism to be recognized and be given the respect that it's due in the broader culture, and particularly in the halls of power. Like Matthew Simpson, who becomes a bishop just before the Civil War, starts to sort of be comfortable demanding from politicians, and even has access to presidents, patronage, basically rewarding Methodists with jobs based on election results and so forth. And Methodism starts to pursue the culture, I think, instead of being more clearly sort of, in the beginnings, Methodism doesn't think it has any chance of influencing the culture. So it's not even really like a possibility. And once they get to be a third of Christians in the United States, they think, oh, we can actually like change the country, not just change individual people's lives and spread scriptural holiness. And so the sense of the scope of what they're trying to do changes. And I think that then that actually changes Methodism itself, so that Methodism starts to be influenced by the culture more. And this is a long way of answering your question, but I think that this is how I sort of summarize it when I'm out in the church talking to folks about it. I think that the dominant cultural understandings of like politeness, for example, infiltrate Methodism and redefine what Methodism is and can do, so that in church, the same things that you wouldn't do like at a cocktail party or something, at a gathering of polite people, the same things you wouldn't talk about there, you also wouldn't talk about in church. And stereotypically, those three things are religion, politics, and money, right? Like, you wouldn't ask someone in the passing of the peace in church, hey, how much money do you make, right? That would be seen as a lacking social awareness and impolite. In the same way, you wouldn't or shouldn't ask someone who they're going to vote for. And the irony for me is, I think a lot of United Methodists today would actually be most comfortable thinking it was appropriate to ask people about their politics, because I think there's such a kind of strong sense of, like, this is our mission in a sense. And the third one, I think when you say it, it sounds crazy and it kind of unmasks it, but I think it really became reality in a lot of Methodist contexts. It's also not polite to ask people about their religion, like, do you believe in God and so forth. And so in the passing of the peace in a lot of Methodist churches today, if you said, how is your faith in Jesus really? I think a lot of people would feel like that's not an appropriate question. Like, you shouldn't be asking me that. And I think when you say that in that way, that sounds sort of not helpful, right? But it also, I think, it became the cultural sort of value. So there was a way in which Methodism moved away from the class meeting forces you to talk about your present relationship with God, and you have to have a present relationship with God to do that. And in sort of more polite and nominally Christian contexts, there starts to be more effort to just, it's a performance of kind of a religious identity that isn't necessarily like, doing things under the surface, which of course for Wesley is essential.
I just recently had a conversation with a pastor who, understands the value of class and band meetings, but was getting some pushback from his people about, well, why should we do that? We don't. And it was almost like it sounded like they didn't get it because it wasn't an information-based gathering. Like there's not like an active Bible study or a curriculum and stuff like that. And so we were just kind of talking about it. And I said, it's a spiritual meeting. It's a meeting where you talk about spiritual things. It's not just information. And you have to have a language to describe your spiritual life. And if the only way that you engage your relationship with God is by learning about him, but never engaging him in relationship or the Holy Spirit or encountering Jesus Christ, then yeah, it's going to be confusing when you get into a group of people and someone says, how is it with your soul? Or how is your life with Jesus really? It's understandable that people would be like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know what you're even talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, we've formed from, I think, multiple generations. Our process of formation has actually been away from this kind of formation, right? We haven't prepared people that you have, like, Jesus is a person that you have a relationship with, and therefore you can give an account of that relationship to other people. You can talk about it and give people updates on it in the same way grandparents love to talk about their grandkids, or spouses can talk about with friends how their marriage is, or those kinds of things. And there's been I think a malformation in that sense. And it part of what's interesting to me is that when your life isn't involved, curriculum doesn't even stick. I mean, I think the last generation of United Methodism has been as addicted and dependent on curriculum as the key to salvation as any ever before. And we so clearly don't have the most intelligent, thoughtful Christian generation ever. In fact, it seems like it's often I taught on the doctrine of the Trinity in an ecclesial context a while back, and after I'd done it for 2 weeks, somebody came up to me and was just like, I really thought about what you said, but I just want you to know I don't think you have to believe that to be a Christian. And I was just kind of like, that, like, no, you do. That is the basic
you do.
You have to believe that's what it means to be a Christian. And the fact that that's somebody could say that who's been actively involved in the church for years and years and years, it's actually, to me, more of a sign not of where they're at, but more a sign of how basic the church is failing people that it's called to serve and to disciple and to form.
Yeah, just to clarify, y'all, Trinity, it's a non-negotiable.
That whole divinity of Jesus thing.
Yeah, you have to believe that.
They fell down and worshipped him. FYI.
Go ahead, David.
Well, I mean, so Kevin, you know, the lot's changing in Methodism right now, and you know, we if we ever get to have a general conference, there's likely to be some type of division. You know, we have the protocol that's on the table, and be the post-separation church, and then at least one other church emerging out of that, which we right now are just calling the traditionalist church. I mean, what are the big pitfalls for the traditionalist church in the future? What do you think? What will the temptations be? Where could we really slip up going forward?
That's a great question. I think that Corona Tide has shown us some of that. It's been interesting for me to notice, like in the beginning of COVID, and Scott and I have talked about this elsewhere. We don't need to go. Well, we can if y'all want to, but I don't need to go into great detail about this. But it just revealed at the outset that there is I would say, a staggering incoherence in our view of the sacrament of communion. At how fast people were willing to not basically, it felt to me like most United Methodists were very happy to just say worship is something that nothing is missing if it's happening in the same way that we're doing this right now. And just to clarify for listeners, we're all on a video conference. None of us are in the same room, and
which we hate.
Nothing missing. Yeah. You know, and that you can also then bring in embodied practices like the sacrament of communion and still also have there be nothing missing. I think that those are and that disagreement. So there were some people who were strongly opposed to the idea of online communion, and there were other people who were ready to run with it. Some who openly said it doesn't even matter what elements you use, just use whatever you find around your house because it's just supposed to be a meal. And so not being concerned about the disunity being the image that's expressed in the sacrament, right? Some people have crackers and Coke, other people have Hawaiian bread and coffee and so forth, donuts and milk. And just not really an ability to like think through that, like what's actually being expressed there and why that's problematic and so forth. And there's a host of extremely complicated issues, I think, related to that. But one of the things that it pointed out to me is that it's not like the United Methodist Church is solely divided based on its beliefs about whether people who are same-sex attracted should be married in the church and should be able to be married and serve as pastors in the church. The division goes much deeper than that. The incoherence is much more complicated than that, because the argument about online communion cut right across the arguments about human sexuality. I was surprised at how non-predictive, like people who you knew whether they were for or against the church embracing gay marriage were for or against online communion. It didn't necessarily tell you anything. Right. And so I think that there's one of the first challenges, I think, is that folks on the sort of traditionalist side are just, I think, need to have the humility to recognize their own malformation theologically and their own need to sort of get serious about doctrine, to get serious about what we believe, how we think that that's expressed and how we live. To me, the kind of heresy of hyper-individualism has permeated, all sides of the church in ways that are deeply problematic. I also think that there's, go ahead.
I was just going to say, from serving a church, I also know that a lot of the pressure for online communion is coming from the laity, who are, a lot of whom are older, who want to be connected, but they can't feel like they can go to church. So, I mean, I know in my own congregation, like, because we broadcast it on first Sunday of the month, we'll have communion, and then there will inevitably be somebody who at home was like, I just needed to take communion with you, so I did. And there's a pastoral thing. What do you say in that moment, right? I mean, like, this is an 85-year-old woman who, was like, and I'm visiting her, right? Actually, to bring her communion. And I don't know, it's just, there's this longing for embodiment that is an expression there, even if it's a misconstrued, misdirected, practice. And I don't, so.
I just think one of the things that I often feel myself doing in community with people is encouraging people to that like itch, the urge that they have that drives them to make incorrect spiritual decisions out of emotionalism, to focus that into something productive, which is to say, hey, we have in Scripture, there are models for suffering. There are models for offering up your lack, your sense of absence, your sense of disconnection. There are ways to channel that productively to make that a fruitful part of your Christian life. And you can still practice obedience and have a deeper sense of relationship with Christ. So while I am completely sympathetic to the whole disembodied thing, I think we should take communion every week or as often as you can. I would do it every day if I could.
And you could, because you have a person in house who.
Yes, but he won't because but because he won't use his privilege just for me. But I think, I don't know. I just, it's a missed opportunity, I think is what I'm trying to say. There are all kinds of ways to grow. And COVID has exposed a lot, just like Kevin is saying, but it's also revealing a lot of opportunity. And I don't know, to just have deeper connection with Christ. In the moments when I have longed for the embodied presence of Christ in communion, those have been some of my deepest moments of crying out in prayer. And, people say, oh, I miss worship. And what I always say to them is, well, get on your face in your living room. And I understand like being with missing other human beings. I totally understand that. But what are you going to do if you can't? You know what I mean? Like, what if you cannot? What are you going to do? You're going to do what Paul did. Sing songs. Get on your face. Worship. That's what you do. Sorry. My rant is over.
I think that it does get at one of the challenges that I've seen in this, which is how low the church is. Like, we don't have a theology of suffering in the church. And so when a pandemic comes or something comes that is terrible and that no one would want, but you don't have control over, there's, I think, in our sort of high technology society and high control and so forth, we all assume there's a way just to fix it. And so we pivot towards, oh, well, it's not a big deal. We can just do communion online. Well, I mean, in a previous time in a pandemic, you just wouldn't have been able to have communion, because if you couldn't gather together in person for worship, you online communion wasn't an option. Like it just wouldn't have happened. And I think there's the missed opportunity for me has been that the creative energy has, to me, the best and brightest sort of has tended to me to go towards online as salvation in this season. And I actually think there are a lot of creative ways that you can try to fight to have some kind of in-person connection, even in a time where it isn't safe for people to gather inside of sanctuaries in the way that they used to. I mean, Scott's own experience that he shared in other contexts of having communion with a small gathering of people in the church and then going and visiting the shut-ins who are defined as the people for whom it's not safe to come to the church is to me is a great way of expressing that longing and that desire in a time of. I'm also stealing this from Scott as as I do, but in a time of famine, right? Like it's in the beginning of this season, a lot of folks were prone, and myself included, to talk about COVID as a time of fasting, and Scott pointed out rightly that a fast is something that you choose to undergo, and a famine is something that happens to you. And I think that this season is better thought of as a famine. We're not in control. We're not driving the bus. We don't know when it's going to end. We don't know how it's going to turn out. All that stuff, and we're just kind of riding the wave, for better or worse. And but there are ways that we can struggle to find ways to be together as fully and completely as we can, given the realities in different contexts and situations.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a picture that always comes to mind when I think about this, because I know a lot of pastors have done a lot of that, going around and visiting and finding creative ways to offer communion and all kinds of other, pastoral and spiritual disciplines, pastoral services, things like that. But there's a picture in one of my kids' history books of how the priests delivered communion during the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Mm-hmm. And they had these long, like spoons, and people would just like crack the door, and they'd like stick the host inside the door and then bring it out, and then they'd wipe it off and go to the next house. And I'm not sure that necessarily stopped the spread of anything, but I mean, again, it goes to that sort of like that thing you're talking about, that creative sort of. And plus, they had those super cool, scary, terrifying masks
that look like bird beaks.
Yes, here's your Jesus. Also, sweet dreams.
Yeah, and the problem back then was, they weren't giving both the bread and the wine. Like if they'd done the bread and then stuck the spoon in the wine and stuck it back in the wine, they could have been
it's just like
scary. But nope, they just gave the bread.
Hey,
I want to go back to David's question, because I gave a long-winded answer, but there are two other things I want to, you guys may want to riff on or not. But the other two things I think, as far as like what could go wrong as a new church is being formed, is I think first and foremost putting anything but the gospel at the center. I think that's been a struggle that American Methodism has faced for quite a while, of sort of competing gods, lowercase g. And so I think the first thing is a kind of persist. And I don't think anyone thinks they're doing that, but I think that it does happen quite a bit. I think idolatry is a challenge that the church struggles with and faces. And I think related to that is, secondly, just I think that a traditionalist expression of Methodism needs to start by settling in their spirits that they will never have cultural approval. And I think that's going to be a harder word for some people who have been in places where they've been in the halls of cultural power context, still being more conservative and so forth. But I think that the reality is that, and I mean, there's just so many different ways you can sort of see this in our current society. Politicians who in their own lifetimes are now shaming other people for things they themselves said 15 years ago. And I mean, there's just been a major change in the culture and so forth. And I think that Christians who are committed to the great tradition on things like marriage and human sexuality and so forth, I think just have to come to terms with the fact that we live in an increasingly post-Christian culture where being a Christian isn't like going to get you a pat on the head from folks in the halls of power. And I think that's a mistake. If there's a kind of conception of Methodism that the desire is to be big for the sake of influence and so on and so forth, I think those things are prone to become idols if they aren't at the outset, that will be very unhelpful. And I think what needs to happen is to get as clear as we can about what the Lord requires, and to sort of fortify ourselves and settle in our spirits by the grace of God, that all we want and all we're about is just pursuing what the Lord requires. Just being faithful, and that trusting, whether that leads us to being prospered and growing, or whether that leads to us being despised by all people, that we have to leave that in the Lord's hands. Trust that to the Lord. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge. It's extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm. I'm working on despised right now. It's going pretty well.
I was going to say, I think you can check that one off your list there.
I know, right? It's like check.
But in all seriousness, I think that's why this sort of understanding of social holiness is essential, because when you're in those places, it's not easy. Like, we shouldn't be calloused to like the reality that it's hurtful to be hated by people. It's hurtful to have people say things about you that aren't true and that are intentional distortions of what you actually believe and so forth. But it's going to happen. And I think that people, like, we need each other for support and encouragement to also come back to reality as we need it, but also not to become hard-hearted and angry and hostile, because our mission is ultimately actually to rescue people who hate us. I mean, that's the mission of the church in a pretty basic way. But it's one, and I think that's one of the reasons Wesley thinks if you try to do that on your own, and you don't have people who really know you, and that you can sort of let things out, and they can also say, like, this isn't God's best for you. You know, you have to be able to forgive that person. You have to be able to let go of the bitterness that's seeping in this place. If you don't have those kind of contexts, those kind of places, you'll be taken out. But I also think there's, in the providence of God, there is actually a way in which that's a good apologetic strategy, because people in this culture are desperate for community and connection. People have forgotten how to do that well. And so if the church can figure out how to help people connect in healthy and meaningful ways, I think that will be a key piece of our evangelistic strategy.
Well,
All right, you ready for lightning round, Kevin?
I guess.
Is this our very smooth and elegant transition?
Is this the Hot Pockets round or whatever that is?
Yeah, hot take.
Pockets round.
Okay.
Oh my God.
I'm going to ask you a question, and you don't have to think about it. Just answer quickly, okay?
And I just trust that if it's an inappropriate answer, you'll edit it, right?
Oh, we always edit them out, of course.
Yeah, we'll edit it out. Don't worry.
I'm just sorry. I'm sorry in advance.
Okay, Kevin, old school Methodism or new school Methodism?
Old school Methodism.
Can you play the guitar that's right behind you in your office?
Depends on what you mean by play.
Online communion, yes or no?
No.
Yeah.
What's your favorite NFL team?
Oh man, why would you do that to me? The Dallas Cowboys.
Right on. What is the best Christian podcast?
Oh man. Let's see what.
It's a lightning round, Kevin.
I'm trying to think.
Right on your screen. Just look at your screen.
Let's come back to that one.
All right. What is the best online Wesleyan magazine?
The best online Wesleyan magazine. Firebrand.
Oh, good one.
He couldn't remember the name.
Podcast. Plain Truth, a Holy Spirited podcast.
Oh, there you go.
I thought of one.
Wow.
I thought of one.
Last question. Has anyone ever told you that you look like Rivers Cuomo?
No.
I'm telling you that. But he's good. He's good looking.
Okay. He can probably play the guitar that's behind me too.
He can definitely do that. All right. Good job. That's it for the lightning round.
That's it for the lightning round. I mean, I was going to say, Kevin, to your point earlier, about.
I think you're better looking than Rivers Cuomo, by the way, Kevin. Just letting you know.
Thank you. I don't have a picture in my mind of what Rivers Cuomo looks like.
What is happening right now?
I don't know.
Like, what's going on?
Back to you, Maggie.
Well, that's okay. No, I was just going to say that I appreciated what you were saying about about not having a hard heart about being, because it's true. It's really hard though to admit to, or not that you have to admit to the people who are hating you that it sucks to be hated, but it's just hard to admit in general, that it's hard to be like maligned so like openly,
Yeah, I mean, if you're reviled publicly and you're okay with that, then there's something wrong that's happened. Either you're kind of operating on a different scale than most people do, or you have like your soul has become distorted in a way that is not God's best. But it's definitely challenging.
Yeah,
Yep.
Jesus wept over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It hurt
Definitely.
to be rejected.
I just come back to that because I think that a lot of the sort of the coping mechanism that I see online from people who would identify themselves as traditionalists or conservative Christians or whatever kind of identifier you feel the need to put in front of the word Christian, is this kind of hyper defensive, I don't care, it's whatever, who cares what those people think, and things like that. And so it makes me sad, even though I feel the impulse within myself too. And I'm very unafraid of conflict, which is I'm sensing sarcasm, which is clearly why the Lord led me to be friends with people like Scott Kisker and David Watson, because I don't have a hard time being in conflict, either by direct association or just like guilt by association. Just kidding. Anyway,
I think it would be a great podcast episode just to talk about that sort of in depth. Like, how do you contend for the truth in public spaces and also continue to pursue holiness? I think those things, at least for me, oftentimes feel like they pull me in different directions.
I actually think what you were saying before, you have to. I mean, this is the point of having small group. You have to have people who actually know you and know that you are wounded by this stuff, and know that you are conflicted, and that you're trying to be faithful, and and who are willing to hold you accountable if you start to like hate other people.
Yeah, and who also know that you aren't the things that you're being accused of.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
wasn't that though? I mean, Wesley knew that this would happen. It happened to Wesley.
Yeah.
Right. He was. And then he did put into the general rules that we are to do good by running with patience the race which is set before us, denying ourselves and taking up our cross daily, submitting to bear the reproach of Christ, to be as the filth and offscouring
of the world. Yes.
And looking that men should say all manner of evil falsely about us for the Lord's sake.
Kevin, are there any parting thoughts? Are there anything that you want, wisdom that you would like to leave our listeners with to cancel out, everything we say?
I do think that Wesley has resources for how to contend for the faith delivered once and for all, and in challenging times. And I think that he has several resources that are helpful to that end, and I think he's worth engaging and continuing to struggle with. I think in times where we think that we're living in unprecedented times, those are times where it's particularly important to read voices from different eras, because it will remind you of, people had other problems that were overwhelming to them too. Like, you should go read Wesley's journal entries when people were wandering around London in the middle of the night thinking there was about to be a giant earthquake that would swallow up the city because somebody had prophesied the end of the world. And, I think it's helpful to get that kind of perspective at times. And I think it's also important especially for pastors listening and folks that have been in the denominational politics stuff to just kind of check in with themselves. If you are getting to that place where you're saying you don't care anymore, or you're becoming bitter or just only pessimistic about the future, do what you need to do to recenter, because we are never those without hope. We worship a risen Savior who has stared even death and hell in the face and has overcome them. And so it's okay. I think we do need a theology of suffering. It's okay for things to be hard and challenging and all of that, but also we should still be people that have great hope and have a measure of strong, settled confidence in every situation.
Amen.
Good word, Kevin.
That's right. That is a good word. All right, Kevin, where can people read your blog?
KevinMWatson.com.
All right. You guys all need to go check out Kevin's blog at KevinMWatson.com. You need to go on Amazon right now and buy all of his books, even the really expensive academic one.
Just don't complain to me about how expensive they are. It's not my fault.
It's not his fault. And also, you guys give us a follow on Twitter or like us on Facebook at Holy Spirit Pod, and give Spirit and Truth a follow on Twitter at Spirit Truth Life. And if you haven't already, go to firebrandmag.com and search out Kevin's most recent article.
Real Methodism.
Thank you. The title is escaping me. Real Methodism. It's awesome. And Scott, was there anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I was just going to say, thanks to United for what they do to make this possible. At least some of us are in the building, so.
Okay. Thank you to United.
Don't forget to follow Scott on Twitter at social media chupacabra.
Sounds like we're setting up a spoof account now.
I'm going to do that, yes.
You should.
You may not tweet for me.
We're going to post advertisements, Christmas sweater sales. That's what we're going to do. Anyway, I wish you guys had the pleasure of talking to these guys. These are some of the best guys I know. Anyway, that's been our podcast for today. And thank you, Kevin, for being our guest. And we'll come back to you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.